I want to start with a couple of expressions of appreciation. To the program committee, thanks for offering me an opportunity to attend my second Society of American Foresters conference. But I do feel compelled to share with the rest of you a deeply personal secret. To me, being here feels a lot like a college reunion. Here's why. My first SAF meeting was in California in the 1960s. At that time, I was an undergraduate at Humboldt State University, and attending an SAF meeting was really a big deal, a new experience. And what do I remember about that SAF meeting all those years ago? The overarching topic was the fire crisis in the West. Coffee break chatter was mostly about sharing war stories about how bad this or that fire had been. But especially, many speculated about what kind of a different fire policy might make sense, preferably one that didn't cost so much. Sound familiar? As I've listened to coffee conversations at this meeting, it sounds much like my college days a half-century ago. As a fisheries biologist, my lesson learned: some things in forestry, apparently, are always going to be with us. A second thank you. I also thank the program committee for persuading me to grapple with a question, once again, that has persistently annoyed me for nearly 3 decades. It is also a question that may nag you. So what is this irksome little question? Who posed it, and why has it been so troublesome? The question was asked by a high school student at the end of a routine Science Day tour, one of many show-and-tell tours at the EPA's National Research Laboratory in Corvallis. This is one of those other duties as assigned that we all do. But trust me, these tours are not normally memorable events in the life of a deputy director. A little context. With a staff of several hundred energetic but bureaucratically challenged scientists, as deputy, and for those of you early in your careers, keep performing well, and you too might one day have a job like this. One similar to working as a school principal, especially a principal assigned to a middle school in a troubled neighborhood. Actually, I enjoyed my job. But lab tours were often a welcome breather for my daily task of keeping the bureaucratic peace. Better yet, lab tours were not technically challenging, nor did they ever get into the deep and difficult topics, and students almost always accepted your statements as the revealed truth. In fact, as tour guide, your biggest challenge was finishing a tour with the same number of students that you started with. But one of those tours turned out to be very different. After this particular tour, as we were waiting for their bus to return, one of the high school students pulled me aside and spoke to me in a quiet, intense, and worried voice. She asked something like this: "Nearly everyone in my family makes a living off the land, mostly as farmers and loggers. Every one of them thinks that scientists are biased against their activities, and even biased against most anything that people might do to change the natural environment. Are they correct? Are your scientists biased?" Clearly, she was not your typical 16-year-old. Regardless, my answer was instant and unequivocal. Science, by definition, is policy neutral. Most definitely, it is not value-free, but it is policy neutral. The scientists that we, that is us taxpayer-funded scientists, that we produce, neither favors nor opposes natural conditions. Your family is incorrect. Great answer. Confident, clear, comforting. Indeed, I immediately liked my instant dogmatic response. And even better, she seemed relieved. But nearly 3 decades later, her question still gnaws at me. It was like having a bad case of poison ivy. Scratch it and it feels better for 30 seconds or so, and then it itches worse than ever. My simplistic, confident textbook answer never made that itch go away. Worse, the more I thought about her question, the less I liked my answer. She was onto something. Over my half-century career, the scientific enterprise and the context in which it operates has changed, and changed a lot. At least in natural resource-related disciplines, the credibility, the impartiality, and the deference afforded scientists have all diminished. I base this conclusion on my experiences as both a producer of science and in other jobs as a user of science. My observation is that even many of those who don't trust scientists tend to be fairly supportive of the scientific method as a way of acquiring knowledge. They just don't trust scientists to impartially follow the scientific method. For a recent example, last year's YouGov U.S. national poll found that 55% of respondents, more than half, had little or no trust in what they hear from scientists as accurate and reliable. Even worse, only 29%, less than a third, said that scientific studies are rarely or never influenced by political ideology. Many people out there simply do not trust scientists to be impartial. Here's what I think's happened. It is not that the scientific enterprise has been infiltrated with fabricators of data, nor has scientific fraud become pervasive. These things do happen, but in my experience, they are fairly uncommon. What is common these days is the tolerance, even encouragement, for scientists to intentionally push science beyond its proper and appropriate boundaries, and far beyond the basic standards of the scientific method, the core of the scientific enterprise for over 3 centuries. Using science to push personal or employer policy preferences is now widespread, and such now common behavior has the consequences for everyone: scientists, natural resource managers, appointed bureaucrats, elected officials, and the public. One result? The all too common view that anyone, no matter how poorly informed, no matter how dubious the source of the quoted information, anyone has the right to his or her own facts. As the late New York Senator Daniel Moynihan warned, everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but he's not entitled to his own set of facts. Even worse, some of us, yes, professional scientists like me, who believe we should be objective and unbiased, have contributed to this erosion of trust. Whether it is a policy over the future of GMOs, whether to add fluoride to drinking water, what, if anything, to do about climate change, pick your favorite example. The distrust of scientists is rampant. In portions of academia, especially in some liberal arts disciplines, from what I witness, the postmodern view of science seems to hold sway. That is, there is no such thing as scientific fact, only opinions about what truth might be. For example, relative to scientific objectivity, the president of the American Sociological Association this year encouraged its 14,000 members, mostly professors, to, quote, challenge the concept of objectivity and its role in maintaining hierarchies of power, end of quote. No such thing as a scientific fact? Give me a break. This situation is especially unfortunate because many public policy issues cry out for high-quality science that is policy relevant, policy neutral, and beyond reproach. But search the internet and you will find websites that offer self-defined scientific rationales for any conceivable political or policy position you can possibly imagine. Truly, the so-called democratization of science has arrived. Everyone's scientific opinion seems to be equal. Postmodern thinking on steroids. In the areas of the scientific enterprise where I spend my time, usually environmental, natural resource, or ecological policy disputes, many players take it as a given that scientists have been corrupted. Corrupted not by some sleazy financial shenanigans, but rather by something less obvious and perhaps more insidious. Let me be specific. When I travel outside the confines of my cloistered professional world, I run into people who are highly skeptical of what scientists say or write. And the skepticism comes from both the political right and left. Oh, they still value scientific information, but increasingly they have simply lost faith in the political and policy neutrality of scientists themselves. For sure, there are many causes of this unfortunate state of affairs, and the professional literature is full of speculation as to why it has developed. Today, I want to focus on one really important cause: the pervasive misuse of science as a weapon in policy advocacy. Specifically, I'm referring to the increasing prevalence and acceptance of normative science. Call it advocacy science, call it junk science, call it politically or policy biased science, or stick with normative science. Regardless of what you call it, it is deceitful and it has no legitimate place in policy deliberations. What exactly is normative science, and how does it differ from real science? Think way back to Philosophy 101. Normative science is a type of information that is developed, presented, or interpreted based on an assumed and usually unstated preference for a particular policy or class of policy choices. Of course, there are many other reasons why people have lost faith in the policy neutrality of the scientific enterprise, but normative science is a big one, and it is one that we scientists and users of science can do something about. Now here's how it happens, and here's what we can do about it. Not one of us would slip into normative science, right? Now, be honest. I admit on a few occasions I have succumbed to the dark side of the scientific enterprise. Not concerned because you are only a user of science, you should be concerned. And for sure, as a scientist, you really should be concerned. Its rampant prevalence threatens to marginalize the legitimate and essential role that science ought to play in natural resource policy and management. Still skeptical? For many years, I've taught a graduate class in ecological policy at Oregon State University. Most of my students have one or more science or natural resource degrees. In class, I do my best to encourage students to watch out for normative science. And I talk a lot about how they, at least those who wish to work as scientists, ought to follow good practices and remain policy relevant, but policy neutral. If they want to become policy advocates, fine, no problem, but keep their policy advocacy out of their science. At a minimum, eliminate those ought and should statements from their science. Again, back to Philosophy 101, another definition. At its most fundamental level, what we loosely call regular or traditional science is simply information. But information gathered in a rational, systematic, testable, and reproducible manner. A first principles fact, right? Science contains no good or bad policy judgment, no implied policy preference. It is only one type of information in natural resource policy and management debates. This is also true of the applied sciences that most of us do. Someone has identified a policy or management problem for which scientific information might be helpful. No problem, but the same rules apply. However, science is not value-free. Let me explain. Think about funding research. The decision about which science topic gets pursued is a value-based choice. In fact, even the selection of the scientific method to answer a question rather than use alternative ways to acquire knowledge is itself a value-based decision. But science should be policy neutral. Yes, policy relevant for sure, but policy neutral. The key point: regular science becomes normative science when a policy preference gets embedded in the research design or interpretation of the data, and often this transgression passes unnoticed. I am using the term scientist to describe a person who generates or interprets information by applying the scientific method, the same method you learned way back in your first middle school science course. Yes, I know that loads of people have science degrees, and many call themselves scientists. But many science degree holders are often employed as natural resource managers, pollution regulators, environmental advocates, commodity advocates, roles where using scientific information may be hugely important, but it is only one of many factors that such people deal with. Okay, enough of the definitions. Back to my graduate class full of young, aspiring scientists. After discussing the use and misuse of science in public policy, and mostly being met with body language showing skepticism, one student finally raised his hand. But his demeanor had the aura of frustration, if not complete futility. But he was one of the more reflective students, and once I saw his hand go up, I instinctively knew that at least he would be supportive of my idealized vision, the high school civics vision of the proper role of science. Yes, as only an idealistic and passionate young scientist might say, Dr. Lackey, things have changed since you were a graduate student. You are living in a dream world. Most of the public assumes we are policy advocates. These days, the only people who really trust scientists to be policy neutral are scientists themselves. You need to get real. Wow, is this the breed of scientists our universities are now producing? Scientists who see themselves as members of a policy advocacy group? Is this what scientists have become? At the time, my instinct was to disregard such an assertion, especially one coming from an inexperienced graduate student. But I well remember a scolding that I received early in my career from a very experienced government lawyer. And it is not a pleasant recollection, even after many years. We were relaxing in a pub after spending a long day listening to dueling scientists testifying in an Endangered Species Act hearing. I was trying to convince him, a lawyer, from my perspective as a scientist, that it seemed reasonable to presume that opposing sides should be able to agree on the basic science relevant to this particular case, or simply reach consensus on the so-called scientific facts. After all, the legal debate should be over interpretations of law, not science, right? My argument seemed pretty self-evident to me, perhaps even a platitude. In retrospect, perhaps I was badgering him a bit too much, but his response still stuns me all these years later. Quoting here, Bob, you guys, and by that he meant you scientists, you guys have no credibility. All of you spin your science to lend support to whatever policy outcome you or your employer favors. I'm not sure science was ever a beacon of truth, but it sure isn't now, at least not in the legal arena. I watch scientists routinely misuse science in case after case. I didn't buy it at the time, but my thinking has changed. Pick any of today's policy issues: wildfire, climate change, GMOs, endangered species, childhood vaccinations, wolf reintroduction, fracking. Much of the public no longer trusts scientists to present just the facts. And it is not only members of the public who are distrustful. Many natural resource managers and policymakers are badgered by self-professed experts wrapped in the accoutrements of the scientific enterprise, but corrupting science for use as an advocacy weapon. A deplorable state of affairs for sure. Okay, what can scientists themselves do to help clean up this mess? Let me offer one common sense action item that every newly minted scientist and every seasoned scientist can and should adopt. Only one action item, but whether you work for a government agency, a consulting firm, a policy advocacy organization, a business enterprise, or a university, post this prominently on your office wall. Quote, scientists' values, that is, their policy preferences, are no more important than those offered by anyone else. Let me slightly rephrase this message. Quote, scientists' values, that is, their policy preferences, are not in any way special. They are not. When a scientist steps outside the narrow bounds of scientist, in reality our only area of special expertise, we should remember the blunt admonition of Nobel Prize winner Richard Feynman, who often called the scientist's scientist. It was Feynman who famously cautioned us, quote, I believe that a scientist looking at a non-scientific problem is just as dumb as the next guy. Looking for a great example, think of the unrelenting debate over warming Earth, a warming caused in part by human activities. Like the epic and endless battles of the Middle Ages, the policy debate has become a take-no-prisoners bloodbath, where policy neutrality is not a safe option, even in much of the scientific enterprise. In this conflict, unlike the Middle Ages, it is not armored knights on war horses that are the most effective combatants, nor is it foot soldiers with lethal longbows. No, the combatants are often scientists who have ditched the tenets of the scientific method and taken up arms for one of the many competing policy armies. It shouldn't be that way, right? After all, science is but one of many inputs needed by policymakers, and all policy options involve winners and losers, right? Even if all the scientific facts are known in their entirety, there always remains at the core of all policy debates some unpleasant trade-offs. At its core, policymaking is essentially the process of picking winners and losers. No wonder the policy game is so contentious. But shouldn't it be reasonable to agree on the scientific facts about the policy issue, at least the one at hand, and let the political process select from competing values and trade-offs? Apparently not. And worse, think about the practical challenge of confronting the public. Who of the many so-called scientists would offer opinions on climate change will the public trust? Those employed by the Sierra Club, the American Petroleum Institute, Greenpeace, the U.S. Wind Energy Association, the Union of Concerned Scientists, the United Nations, Weyerhaeuser? Not likely. But presumably the public can trust scientists employed by government agencies, right? Well, let's think about this question from the vantage point of a generic member of society. Imagine that you are the ordinary Joe or Jane citizen. Now, how would you decide which scientist to believe about climate matters? Who would you trust to present just the facts, ma'am, without the political spin? Scientists, like everyone else, have political leanings. Let's not be naive here. We also know how, as a demographic group, scientists these days tend to reside on one side of the political spectrum. For example, a recent national opinion survey of U.S. scientists revealed that an individual scientist was 9 times more likely to be assigned to one political party than to the other major political party. Wow, a 9-to-1 ratio favoring one party? A little audience participation here. Your challenge is to guess whether the 9-to-1 ratio favors Democrats or Republicans. I'll make a wild guess and presume that you came up with the correct answer. What a shock. But the bigger shock to me, I am confident that not one of you is surprised. And few, if any, members of the general public would be surprised. Unless someone still believes in the tooth fairy, it is not surprising that a reasonable person might be slightly suspicious of such a skewed political inclination of the scientific enterprise, and how it might affect Joe or Jane's trust in science, even for government science. Let me use another example, one closer to our disciplinary homes in forestry, fisheries, wildlife, and so on. How slipping into normative science undermines trust in scientists. Remember that question from the high school student: is our science biased towards natural? A simple question, but I'm working in academia these days, so a straightforward yes or no will not suffice. To start, put on your science hat and be honest here. Imagine that the public owns a 5,000-acre stand of old-growth fir. Is preserving this stand of old growth preferable to removing the trees and building a destination resort and golf course on the same 5,000 acres? It is not, at least not without assuming, perhaps unwittingly, a policy preference, a value choice. The result, a classic example of normative science. It may look like a scientific statement. It may sound like a scientific statement. It is often presented by people who we assume are operating as scientists. But such statements in science are nothing more than policy advocacy masquerading as science. Anyone following basic scientific principles would say pristine ecosystems are neither superior nor inferior to human-altered ones. Different, for sure, but not better or worse. Many of my natural resource graduate students choke when they hear this assertion. Are not pristine ecosystems self-evidently in better shape than human-altered ones? Is not an old-growth forest obviously superior to a tree farm, better than a cornfield, and surely vastly better than the same land covered by another Costco parking lot? But who says the natural ecosystems are superior to human-altered ones? Some advocates push this policy assertion all the time, and people expect this. No surprise, for sure. But certainly not scientists, right? Wrong. All those years ago, the high school student was correct. My new answer: science is often policy biased towards natural. Skeptical? One more example. In scientific publication, why is it that native species are almost always assumed to be preferable to non-native species? Nothing in science says that one species is innately better than another, that one species is inherently preferred, or that one species should be protected and another eradicated. In science, when we see the words natural, healthy, degraded, biological integrity, all these terms and many others have embedded assumptions about what someone or some organization regards as a desirable value choice, a preferred policy choice. These and similar words have no place in science. They are classic examples of normative science. Their use in scientific publications is simply policy advocacy disguised as science. The words are fine in management, expected in policy advocacy, but not okay in science. Let me wrap up by offering Charles Darwin's advice to scientists. Remember that he was under a lot of social pressure to make his scientific findings conform to the dominant political and theological views of the time. His pithy advice to scientists: a scientific man ought to have no wishes, no affections, a mere heart of stone. Strict, uncompromising, and unequivocal advice, but spot on for scientists both then and now. For those of you who are currently working as managers or policymakers, the late Senator Moynihan offered insight about the risks of taking management and policy advice from scientists when they step outside the narrow realm of science. There are some mistakes only someone with a PhD can make. It is facts, including probabilities, uncertainties, and caveats, that the public and decision makers need from scientists. Equally important, the public, decision makers, and managers do not need scientists pushing their personal opinions about which policy option should be chosen, nor stealthily advocated in favor of policy preferences by slipping into normative science. Thank you.